Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Daniel. He was the statesman prophet, and we're continuing, of course, our survey of the Old Testament. The book of Daniel takes place over a very long period, and it spans the Babylonian captivity. That is, Daniel himself is taken hostage early in the process. Remember, we described that the Babylonian captivity actually started in three phases. First, there were the taking of some nobility, royal hostages like Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That was in 605 BC. Then in 597 BC, we have a second deportation. This time Ezekiel is taken. We notice Ezekiel down here on our timeline. And he's taken away to captivity along with 10,000 of the craftsmen. And then finally, the temple is destroyed in 586 BC. Jerusalem and the temple both destroyed, and there is that final captivity taken away. That's in the year 586 BC. And now we have the full-blown Babylonian captivity, and that's going to begin to come to an end. I think that's going to happen in phases too. But in the year 539 BC, Babylon will be overthrown. There will be not just a new king, but a new empire that has come to the forefront, and that will be the Empire of the Persians. And the book of Daniel is actually going to take us into that, and we're going to see a portion of the Persian rule as well. So Daniel spans that entire period. Daniel chapter 1 verse 1, we start off in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. So what we have is Babylon, remember, right at the outset, with Nebuchadnezzar, had gone up to Carchemish. There he had been met by the armies of Egypt. Pharaoh Necho had met him at the Battle of Carchemish, and Egypt lost, and lost in a big way. And so subsequent to that, Nebuchadnezzar comes down to Jerusalem. He captures the city of Jerusalem, but he is going to allow the Jews a measure of autonomy, but just to make sure they behave and play nicely. Some royal hostages are taken, including Daniel and his three friends, and they are taken to Babylon. And the rest of the story of Daniel is going to take place in Babylon. Now, an overview of this book, it can be divided into two parts. It's 12 chapters long. The first section is written in the third person. That is, we read about Daniel doing this and Daniel doing that, and sometimes his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But that section is written in the third person. When we get to chapter 8, verse 1, there is a change, and Daniel writes in the first person, I am the one who did this. I, Daniel, do this. I, Daniel, do that. The first section, chapters 1 through 7, give us 7 historical narratives. I suppose you could call the first chapter, I guess, a prelude, but we're going to look at those 7 historical narratives, and then when we get to chapter 8, there will be 4 prophetic visions. So the first section is more historical, although there are visions there, but they're told in the context of their history, and then the last section are these 4 prophetic visions. Some of the features of the book. First of all, we ought to notice, and this is commonly known, that the book of Daniel, at least the first section, is partially written in a language akin to Hebrew, the language of Aramaic, the language of Aram. Nowadays we call that country Syria, but back then they called it Aram. And there's a portion of the book where in the middle of the book it suddenly switches over to Aramaic. What happens is the first section is written in Hebrew, and we get to chapter 2, verse 3, and the king is about to issue an edict, and we read the king issued the edict in Aramaic, and then the edict begins to read in Aramaic, and so that next section is written in Aramaic, but it doesn't stop with the end of the edict. It takes us all the way to chapter 7, the end of chapter 7. And that's all in Aramaic, which is very close to Hebrew. The languages are if you can read one, you can sort of puzzle out the other, but they are technically 2 different languages. And then we get to chapter 8, verse 1, and again we're back to Hebrew again. So this is the only book of the Bible that has a large segment. Sometimes we'll have a verse or two, but where it has a large segment written in the Aramaic language. As we said, the chapter 1 is going to be a prologue, and then we're going to have prophetic history in these narratives relating primarily to the Gentiles. The Jews will be there, but we're going to see both the stories and the visions that are told there will relate primarily to the Gentiles. When we get to chapter 8, even though some of those visions are going to be very close, very similar, this is prophetic history relating to the Jews. Some other features of the book. The emphasis on the kingdom. This is a book that talks quite a bit about the kingdom of God. There's an emphasis here on prayer. We see Daniel continually going to the Lord and praying before the Lord. There's an emphasis here, a good emphasis. And finally, we see a spiritual battle, the like which we have not seen perhaps since the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, where we see not just the Lord against the forces of darkness, but we see them described in a very vivid way, where an angel is going out and all of a sudden he's resisted by what looks like another angel, and so we're told here that there's more than meets the eye. That even though we look at the world and we see bad things happening, there's more behind the scenes that we cannot see, and they are not just hinted at, they are mentioned in the book of Daniel. Now, comparing Daniel and Ezekiel. Ezekiel is a priest who spoke of matters of the Spirit. Daniel is a statesman who spoke on matters of state. Ezekiel emphasizes the times of Israel's glory. Daniel emphasizes the times of the Gentiles, and I guess we could call it their glory as well. Ezekiel, he has his residence in Mesopotamia, not in Babylon per se, but he is a prisoner in Mesopotamia. He's been carried away with the 10,000 of the craftsmen. Daniel was also taken away as a prisoner, but his residence is in a palace, a much more comfortable deportation. Ezekiel, his focus is primarily upon the Jews and upon Israel. There is a section where he speaks about the other nations. Daniel primarily focuses upon the Gentiles in the world, although there's going to be sections where he comes back and looks more specifically at the Jews. Daniel lives in the day of Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, you have to remember, Babylon was an ancient city, had been there for thousands of years. The first mention we have in the Bible goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 11, where we read of the Tower of Babel. And in Hebrew, there's no difference between Babel versus Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon brought this city to the pinnacle of greatness. It became, in his day, the capital of the world. The city was laid out where there was sort of a central citadel, and in the middle of that was this huge ziggurat, this huge temple tower, as well as the palaces. But then there were outer walls that go far beyond our map here, that, according to some accounts, I'm not sure if they're true or not, that might have been 50 miles in circumference. That's very, very big. Perhaps that's an exaggeration. But we have found remnants of outer walls showing that there were both inner and outer walls. The Ishtar Gate is of interest to us because you can go, if you go to Babylon, you won't see it. Babylon's just, parts of it have been restored a little bit, but for the most part it's still in ruin. But if you want to see the Ishtar Gate, you can go to England, and it is there on display at the British Museum. And you can still see the wonderfully intricate engravings of various animals. Some look like horses, some perhaps look like some sort of mythical dragon that are illustrated upon the walls of this great gate. One of the wonders of the world were what was known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The story goes, I don't know if it's accurate or not, the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar built these terraces, and we call them the Hanging Gardens, they really didn't hang, but these terraces of gardens so that his wife, who had been from the mountains of Media and was homesick for those big mountains, now living on the plains of Mesopotamia, could look out her palace window and see a big artificial mountain there. Certainly it was a wonder of the world that continues in reputation even to this day. Now, Daniel chapter 1 tells the story of how Daniel and his friends come to Babylon, and they have a commitment to purity. That is, even though the king calls for a certain diet of what the Jews would have regarded as unclean food, Daniel and his friends say, we won't do that. We're going to stay faithful to our Lord. Daniel chapter 1 verse 8, but Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank, so he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself, and he was given permission, and Daniel prospers as a result of that. The king talked with them, and out of them all, not one was found like Daniel. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, that's the names that we commonly more know them by their Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they entered the king's personal service. And throughout the rest of the book of Daniel, both these, and especially Daniel, will be in the service of the king of Babylon. Verses 1 through 20 of the same chapter conclude, as for every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king consulted them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and conjurers who were in all his realm. And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. So his reign, his rule, his ministry is going to continue throughout the time of Nebuchadnezzar, then after the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and then all the way, because there will be several Babylonian kings after Nebuchadnezzar, and all the way to Cyrus, the Persian king, who conquers the city of Babylon. Now, beginning in chapter 2, we have a number of narratives, and yet they are narratives with visions, at least the first one and the last one here. In Daniel chapter 2, the king has a dream of an image, a very... it's made up of all sorts of different metals, and wise men are called in to try to interpret the dream, and none are able to do it, and only Daniel is able to, and he interprets the dream. We're going to look at the details of that, but let's just see the pattern of this whole section. So there's a dream of an image, and the image represents 4 kingdoms, and we'll find out what those are in a minute. At least most of them are pretty easy to identify. Next, in chapter 3, there's that familiar story of the rescue of Daniel's 3 friends from the fiery furnace. Daniel isn't mentioned in that chapter. Was he on vacation? Was he out of town? We don't know. He's just not mentioned. But there is the rescue of his 3 friends from the fiery furnace. Then in chapter 4, we have Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Again, this time he dreams of a tree which is chopped down. And Daniel again comes in, and he gives the interpretation of the dream. And in the dream, the tree represents not the kingdom, but it represents Nebuchadnezzar himself, who in a fit of pride talks about how great and wonderful he is, and he magnifies himself as if he's God. And God strikes him down, doesn't kill him, but he strikes him mad for a time. And Nebuchadnezzar is humiliated for a time. And it's interesting when we look at the Nebuchadnezzar Chronicles, the Babylonian Chronicles depicting Nebuchadnezzar's reign, that there is an interesting gap that's mentioned here. Now, I don't know if that's just happenstance. Perhaps we found part of the tablets and maybe we didn't find some of the others. But there is a notable gap of a number of years where suddenly we just pass over one portion of Nebuchadnezzar's reign and move to another portion quite a few years down the road. And it puts me in mind of the fact that in the ancient world, in Babylon in particular, the same thing was true in Egypt, that kings did not mention it if something bad happened to them, if they were humiliated, if they lost a battle. They would just pass right over that as if it hadn't happened, and that seems to be the case here as well. Now, in chapter 5, I want you to see that chapter 5 corresponds to chapter 4. In chapter 4, we had Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the tree. In chapter 5, Belshazzar, a later king, actually he's not the king, he's a regent because his father's the king, but his father's out of town, so he's acting king at the time, and Belshazzar sees some handwriting on the wall, and again Daniel comes in and interprets can I call that a vision or a sight, or the handwriting? Daniel interprets it, and again there is a humiliation, although this time it's a permanent humiliation. That very night Belshazzar is put to death, and a new king, a Persian king, comes on the scene. We know him as Cyrus the Great. Corresponding to chapter 3, when we get to chapter 6, there is again a rescue narrative. This time it is Daniel who was rescued from the lion's den, just like in chapter 3 we had the rescue of Daniel's friends from the fiery furnace. And finally, to sum up our narrative section in chapter 7, we have night visions, not of 4 kingdoms. Well, they're going to represent 4 kingdoms, but they are 4 beasts, just as we had 4 parts of the image that represented 4 kingdoms. So chapter 2 and chapter 7 are going to be very similar. Yes, 2 different pictures, but they are pictures of the same thing. Let's look at that. Daniel chapter 2 starts off, there's a vision of a great statue. Daniel chapter 7 starts off, there is a vision of beasts who are coming up from the sea. And in both cases, both the statue and the beast represent the coming of certain kings and the rise of certain kingdoms that are going to come and rise and fall. And that's the meaning of both visions. In Daniel chapter 2, we start off with a head of fine gold. In chapter 7, it is a lion with wings, and in both cases, it represents the kingdom of Babylon, that kingdom that had risen and taken Daniel and his friends captive and would put an end to the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Babylon. Then we continue in Daniel chapter 2. We go from the head, we work our way down to the breast of arms and silver. Likewise, Daniel chapter 7 has a picture of another beast. It's a bear with 3 ribs in its teeth. We don't have to guess too hard. This is the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. It was a sort of a combined kingdom because Cyrus, its founder, was the king of the Medes, or king of the Persians, but his mother was a Mede, and so he was king of both Medes and Persians. And he takes these kingdoms and, at least for the time being, combines them into one united kingdom. Daniel chapter 2 goes from the head to the breast. By the way, let's look at a map. Let's look at a map here of Babylon. Babylon comprised both that area of Mesopotamia along the 2 rivers, and then really pretty much the Fertile Crescent right up to the borders of Egypt. Scholars argue about how much of Egypt did Nebuchadnezzar conquer. He seems to have done a bit of a job on it, but it's unclear as to how much he was actually able to take. The kingdom of Babylon does not last very many years after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Next we have the Medes and the Persians, who are eventually going to come up against Babylon. Cyrus himself, the founder of the kingdom, the united kingdom of the Medes and Persians, first moves all the way to Lydia in what we call Western Turkey and defeats the Lydians, and it's after that he comes back against Babylon, and Babylon falls without almost a fight. In fact, he comes up against it, and the next day marches into the city and has captured it. There's various stories about how he accomplished that. I'm not going to try to weigh between them, but Babylon is conquered and ceases to be a nation, a kingdom, an empire. It's now part of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. Next, Cyrus moves to the east to this area called Bactria, as he's moving in the direction of the Himalayas and the Hindu Kush. And his son Cambyses actually does invade Egypt and goes not just into Egypt, but far south, following the Nile River, eventually sending a contingent all the way, wanting to go to Nubia. It was an ill-fated expedition. The story is told that he also decided to send an army across the desert to the west, all the way to Carthage. That army was never heard from again. Scholars and treasure hunters are still looking for remains of that army out in the middle of the Sahara Desert. Later Persian kings would attempt to invade Greece. First we have Darius the Great, and then his son Xerxes. The famous battles, first of Marathon under Darius, and then the Battle of Salamis, big naval battle, before which the city of Athens had been burned. But ultimately the Greeks are able to drive out the Persians, and the Persians content themselves with merely getting the Greeks to fight among themselves for the next couple of hundred years, and that works nicely for a few hundred years. So the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians is going to last about 200 years. The next kingdom in Daniel chapter 2, we've been looking at the vision of a great statue, and it goes from the head to the breast, now to the belly and thighs of bronze. Likewise, in Daniel 7, we had the lion, the bear, and now the leopard. Think about this. A leopard's a very fast-moving animal, and it's a leopard with 4 wings, which makes it even faster if possible, and 4 heads. And this represents the Greek Empire. The Greeks come along, like I said, the Persians rule for 200 years, and then Alexander the Great, this young Macedonian king, he's barely out of his teens when he comes to the throne, and in just a matter of a few years, he marches across Anatolia, actually does that within a space of a few months. He comes down into Egypt, going all the way out to the temple of Amun at the there's an oasis way out there in the middle of the desert, and Alexander goes all the way there. Then he retraces his steps, comes up through Mesopotamia and into the heart of the Persian Empire, where in the final battle, he's fought the Persians on 2 great battles up to this point, but in the final battle of Arbela, he fights the Persian Empire and becomes now the king of the Persian Empire. It now becomes a Greek empire, a Macedonian empire. Alexander himself isn't finished yet. He marches all the way to the Hindu Kush and then into India. And he only stops when his men finally refuse to go any further. They say, "Please take us home. We're so tired of all this," and he takes them back to Babylon. He's actually planning other expeditions when in Babylon, at the age of 33 years old, Alexander becomes sick and dies. Next, after Daniel chapter 2, after we saw the head and the breast and the belly, now we come to the legs of iron and clay and 10 toes. Likewise, in Daniel chapter 7, that's going to be a beast with iron teeth and 10 horns. And the question comes up, who is this? Is this the Roman Empire, perhaps? Or is this someone else, one of the generals of Alexander, actually a general of Alexander, one of those other Macedonian kings, someone we know as Antiochus IV. And notice I put a question mark by both of these. Is it one? Is it the other? Is it something else? And admittedly, it's not entirely clear. I think there is going to be some helpful hints along the way. But let's look at the rest of the pattern, and then we'll speak of the history and see if we cannot make a determination. Continuing the latter part of these chapters, in Daniel chapter 2, finally after all of those images, we have we're told that all previous kingdoms are destroyed by a stone that is cut without hands. Likewise, in Daniel chapter 7, the Ancient of Days takes his seat and passes judgment, and this pictures the coming of the Lord and his kingdom. You see, in Daniel chapter 2, it goes on to say that a new kingdom will be set in place that will never be destroyed. In Daniel chapter 7, the Ancient of Days takes his seat, passes judgment, and his kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. And so that is the coming of the Lord and his kingdom. We know how the story ends. We're not entirely sure how we get there from here. And this comes into focus when we look at Daniel chapter 7 and then compare it with the next chapter, Daniel chapter 8. Some lessons, though, from Daniel chapter 7. First of all, the earthly power that we see in and of itself sometimes degenerates into brutality. Think about it. The kingdoms of the world and the kings are described in terms of beasts. That is, they are acting rather beastly. And sometimes kings and kingdoms do exactly that. But it is the tendency of brutality to increase. That is, people as a rule and brutality and kingdoms don't usually get nicer. Usually they get just the opposite of that, left to themselves, unless there is some other influence in them. When restoration takes place, it is an act of God, and I'm speaking not in the localized sense, but in the ultimate sense. When restoration takes place, it's an act of God, not of man. That is, God's kingdom comes, and He's the one who brings it. In other words, the Lord wins in the end. Now, as I said, we want to compare Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8. Even though this is a major division in the book, when we get to Daniel chapter 8, there are some changes. Remember, we said it's first person now. Daniel is saying I, and it's going to be more Jewish-oriented. And yet, there's going to be some wonderful comparisons between these two chapters. In Daniel chapter 7, the dream comes in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. A couple of years later, in the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, this vision is given. And so they're within fairly close proximity to the time that the visions are given. Secondly, in Daniel chapter 7, we just saw that there were successive beasts that rise up out of the ocean. There was Babylon and the Medes and Greece, and that other kingdom, we said, is it Rome, is it Antiochus, and we're going to speak more about what that means, but there's that, we'll just call it the other kingdom for right now. In Daniel chapter 8, there is a vision of a ram standing by a canal, and he is attacked by a goat coming from the west, and we're told what it means, we don't have to guess, that one represents the Medes and the Persians, and that kingdom is attacked by Greece. It's the picture of Alexander conquering the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. So notice Babylon, we're not talking about that anymore. The other kingdom we're not talking about yet. We're only speaking of the Medes and the Persians and their conquest by Greece. That is by Macedonia. When I say Macedonia and Greece, they're part and parcel of the same. At least Alexander would have us think so. They are followed in Daniel chapter 7 by a terrible beast that has 10 horns. In Daniel chapter 8, this vision is followed by a large horn that is broken and gives way to 10 horns. So both places we see 10 horns. In Daniel chapter 7, out comes a small horn that pulls up the 3 previous horns, that utters great boasts, that makes alterations in times and law, and wages war against the saints and wins against them. In Daniel chapter 8, similarly, out comes a small horn that grows exceedingly, that magnifies itself against heaven, that removes the regular sacrifice and throws down the temple. Remember these, because we're going to talk about when these things take place. And flings truth to the ground. In Daniel chapter 7, the end, we've already noted the end, the saints are given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. In Daniel chapter 8, it endures for 2,300 mornings and evenings. You do the math. Remember, you've got, a morning and an evening in each day, so you have to cut that in half. And then what you have is about 3.5 years. In other words, a time, times, and half a time. Another way of saying 3.5 years. In Daniel chapter 7, then after that, sovereignty, dominion, and greatness are given to the saints of the Most High. In Daniel chapter 8, then the holy place will be properly restored. In other words, good things happen at the end of the story. Now, we next are taking it to Daniel chapter 11, and you say, wait a minute, you didn't explain the last two. I think this is going to help us explain it, and I want to see it all as one picture. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 2, Daniel says, and now he's being told this, it's an angel who's come, and now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia, then a 4th will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong throughout his riches, he will arouse the whole empire against the realm of Greece. Remember we talked about Darius does that. Darius goes in and tries to invade Greece, and he sort of gets kicked out. And Xerxes tries to do the same thing, and Xerxes gets kicked out as well. And then finally, and it doesn't say it's going to happen immediately, and we know from history it doesn't happen immediately. It happens 150 years later. But a mighty king will arise, and he will rule with great authority and do as he pleases. I think we're speaking here of Alexander, and in case you didn't get that from verse 3, you get it from the next verse. But as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, for his sovereignty will be uprooted and given to others besides him. As Alexander lay on his deathbed, remember he was only 33 years old, he did not have an heir who was full grown, he did have a little tiny baby. His generals gathered around him and asked, to whom do you give your kingdom? And he whispered out just before he died, to the strongest. And that means when he died, that each of his generals tried to grab a piece of the kingdom. And there were generals fighting generals, and it was split about 7 or 8 or 10 different ways. But when the dust settled, look at chapter 11, verse 5, then the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and obtain dominion. His dominion will be a great dominion indeed. The king of the south refers to one of Alexander's generals who grabbed Egypt and made it stick. His name was Ptolemy. He was one of Alexander's generals. And the Ptolemies, you'll have the first one eventually is going to be known as Ptolemy the First, and then the second, and then the third, and the fourth, all the way down to the 12th. And the Ptolemies are going to rule Egypt for the next couple of hundred years. The last of the Ptolemies will be a gal by the name of Cleopatra. But that's long in the future. Right now we have the Ptolemies ruling Egypt. Meanwhile, one of Ptolemy's sub-generals, sub-lieutenants, we're going to call him that, named Seleucus, was sent up to grab and fight against some of the other generals that had taken control of what we call today modern-day Turkey and Mesopotamia. And Seleucus won, but when he won, he kept it for himself. He didn't share it with Ptolemy. So you have the Seleucus and his descendants. We're going to refer to them as the Seleucids in the north, and Ptolemy in the south. Yes, it's true that there were a couple other generals that grabbed either Macedonia or Greece, but they're not really important to our story, so I'm not going to mention them. Chapter 11, verse 6, and after some years they will form an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north to carry out a peaceful arrangement, but she will not retain her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in, and the one who sired her, as well as he who supported her in those times. There is initially some friendly overtures. There's an intermarriage relationship that's supposed to bind the families together. It doesn't last, and these two kingdoms go back to fighting each other until the coming of a king by the name of Antiochus. You see, the names are Seleucus, but every once in a while there's an Antiochus thrown in there. And there's been a few of them, so he's Antiochus the Fourth. And in his younger days, he had actually, the Seleucids had come up against the Romans, and Antiochus had been sent as a hostage to Rome, just like Daniel had been sent as a hostage to Babylon. Now, he wasn't put in prison or anything. He attended school there. He had a college roommate by the name of Populius, and everything went well. But then when his father died, Antiochus IV escaped, came back to Seleucus, the territories of the Seleucids, to Mesopotamia and Anatolia, and he envisioned himself as another Alexander the Great. He said, I'm going to do what Alexander did, and I'm going to start by going down there and taking out Ptolemy, down there in Egypt. So he had been a hostage in Rome. He now escapes, and he comes against Ptolemy. And doing so, he passes through little tiny Judah. Judah's been sort of in the middle between all these squabbles between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And he comes through Judah, and he says, oh yes, you've got a high priest there. He's persuaded by one of the Jews who covets the position for himself to move the high priest out of his office, to pull down the high priest, and appoint one who was his pro-Antiochus, pro-Seleucid in that position. The Jews do not take kindly to somebody meddling in who's going to be the high priest. And there is a bitter core of resentment. But meanwhile, Antiochus goes down to Egypt. He gets down to Egypt and he wins big. He moves down here, and there is finally one last holdout. He's about to win the last battle, capture the last city, capture the surviving Ptolemy, when out from the city that he is preparing to besiege comes a familiar face, his old roommate from Rome, Populius, and actually now he's a Roman legate, and he says, oh, my old friend, it's so good to see you, and he reaches out to shake his hand, and Populius says to him, I'm representing the Senate and the people of Rome. And he hands him a message from the Senate of Rome, and then he tells him what's in the message, doesn't even have to read it. He says, Rome wants you out of Egypt, go home. Now wait a minute, Antiochus is here with an entire army, and the Romans are telling him, go home. They don't have an army there at all, but he's been to Rome, he's seen the armies of Rome, and he is intimidated. And he says, well, I'll think about it. And Populius, the story goes, draws a circle around him on the sand and says, you can think about all you want. Give me your answer before you step out of that circle. And Antiochus, very much humiliated now, turns around and heads home. he's on his way back, and you know how we have the urban legends that seem to spring up with the speed of light now that we have the internet. They didn't have the internet back then, but urban legends still used to spring up, and an urban legend had made it back to Jerusalem ahead of Antiochus, and the story went that Antiochus had died in Egypt. And the Jews are celebrating, and they're saying, "Oh yes, the wicked king is dead, we're so happy," and he's very much alive. And he comes into Jerusalem, and he imposes the following regulations. First of all, he walks into the temple and he slaughters a bunch of the Jews that are rejoicing over his death. And then he orders that Jews could no longer assemble for prayer. He orders the observance of the Sabbath day to be forbidden. You must work on the Sabbath. He orders that the possession of the Scriptures are now illegal. You must give up your copies of the Hebrew Scriptures. Circumcision is made illegal. It is illegal to circumcise your male child. And dietary laws are illegal. To sort of underscore that point, he slaughters a pig, a defiled animal, on the altar of Jerusalem, and he orders all Jews, have a bite and come now and worship. He puts a statue. Pagan sacrifices are mandated. He builds a statue to Zeus. People aren't so sure what Zeus looks like, so they make it, his metalsmiths and crafters make it look like Antiochus himself, and orders that all worship this statue. He has taken the temple, he has profaned it, and he has placed there an abomination that renders it desolate. The good news is that this eventually sparks off a revolt in Judah. A priestly family by the name of the Hasmoneans, we know them as the Maccabees, but that's a nickname. The word Maccabee means to hammer, and the Maccabees really hammered the Seleucids and Antiochus, and his attention after a while was diverted to other problems in his kingdom. He never did do the Alexander thing. He tried, but he ultimately failed. And so you have the Maccabean revolt, and in 166 BC they managed to retake the temple and to cleanse the temple. In fact, to this day, the Jews celebrate the taking and cleansing of the temple. It's around the time of December at the Feast of Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. The story goes that once they had captured the temple and cleansed it, that there was not enough of the oil to keep the lampstand lit, and it was going to take some time for more oil to be obtained. But there was only enough oil for that day. And the story goes, don't know if it's true or not, but the story goes that the oil sort of magically lasted for the next 7 or 8 days, until more could be obtained. And so even to this day, that feast is celebrated by a lampstand ceremony, as lamps are lit to remember that time of great victory where God had given his people victory and freedom over an oppressing rule. As we said, this was sparked off by a priestly family. That old priest who sparked off his name was Mattathias, but his sons, Judas the Maccabean, and his other surviving sons, eventually not only liberated the temple, but then would rule themselves. Now that's the story, the backdrop against which this prophecy is given. The prophecy is given years before the event. In Daniel chapter 11, verse 29 and 30, notice at the appointed time he will return and come into the south, but this last time it will not turn out the way it did before, for ships of Kittim, now Kittim is what the Jews referred to as the Romans, ships of Kittim will come against him, therefore he will be disheartened and will return and become enraged at the Holy Covenant and take action, so he will come back and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Notice what is happening here is describing the actions of Antiochus, who'd been embarrassed because of the messengers and the ships of Kittim, and he's come back against the land of Israel. And forces from him will arise, desecrate the sanctuary fortress, and do away with the regular sacrifice. That's exactly what took place. And they will set up the abomination of desolation. this statue that Antiochus has set up in the temple. So Antiochus, he called himself Antiochus Epiphanes. That means Antiochus the Magnificent. Actually, the Jews had another name for him. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which meant Antiochus the Madman. He might have lived up to that second name more than the first. But look at this. He comes on the heels of Alexander's generals. He magnifies himself against the Jews and against their God. He puts a stop to the sacrificial system and makes alterations to the law. He attempts to overturn the truth of the scriptures. He has power over the nation of Israel. The passage, and I'm quoting now from Daniel, the prophecies, his sway over the temple endures for approximately 3.5 years. Remember, time, times, and half a time, or as Daniel chapter 8 put it, 2,300 mornings and evenings. And then after that Maccabean revolt had developed and gotten underway, then the holy place is ultimately properly restored, so that the prophecy in detail was fulfilled. Now we turn the page to Daniel chapter 12, verse 1. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of your people, will arise. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued. And the question comes up, of what does this time of distress refer? This time of distress, on the one hand, we can see that the abomination of desolation brought about by Antiochus Epiphanes in 168 BC, that was a time of distress. On the other hand, we can look forward from our vantage point to see that in the year 70 AD, after the temple had been restored, and then for a time the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees, they ruled for a number of years, but eventually they came under Roman domination, and that domination came to a head finally in the year 70 AD, when the Romans, at the instigation of a Jewish revolt, came in and they brutally conquered all the land of Israel. And in the year 70, the Roman general Titus, his father by now was the emperor Vespasian, the Roman general Titus destroyed the temple, burned it to the ground, which I guess you could say made the entire area a desolation. In fact, the next thing that they did is they built a sacrifice to their Roman gods. Later on, other Roman emperors would discuss, they wouldn't actually do it, but they had actually made plans to build a temple to Jupiter. They referred to the Romans' god not as Zeus, but as Jupiter. Same idea, perhaps. But you have again a time of distress that was wrought against the temple in 70 AD. Some folk have looked at this as perhaps some sort of future tribulation. I suppose that's possible. My dealing with future prophecy is underscored by the principle that future prophecy is always easier to interpret after it has been fulfilled. And even then, it's not always that easy. But I suppose this is possible, that this could refer to something still in the future. Or it is perhaps a picture of the final judgment when the Lord comes back, and that's certainly going to be a time of distress, at least for those who do not believe in him. And so any one of these four, or perhaps all four, that are in view. You see, the next verse goes on to say, and many of those who sleep in the dust of the ground will awake, these to everlasting life, but the others to disgrace and everlasting contempt. And that at least looks to the final resurrection and the final judgment. But as for you, Daniel, he's told, conceal these words and seal up the book until the end of time. Many will go back and forth, and knowledge will increase. He's told, seal up the book. And I think the idea there is that you don't know enough to know what it means. And maybe in the immediate future you might not know enough, at least in its entirety. I'm not saying that some of this couldn't have an initial fulfillment in the days of Antiochus. I think it very well could have. And maybe even the days of the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. But more was yet to come. Now, we passed over Daniel chapter 9, but I want to come back now to the prophecy of the 70 weeks that are found in that chapter. Daniel chapter 9 starts off in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, of Median descent, who was made king over the kingdom of the Chaldeans. In the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, observed in the books the number of the years which was revealed as the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet for the completion of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. Daniel had been reading Jeremiah, and in Jeremiah it talks about how the Babylonian captivity would be 70 years duration, and Daniel's counting down on his fingers. Wait a minute, it's getting close to, at least from the time I've been here around 70 years, and we're getting close. And he's wondering, is it going to be fulfilled? So I gave my attention to the Lord God to seek him by prayer and supplications, with fasting, sackcloth, and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed and said, Alas, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant and loving kindness for those who love him and keeps his commandments, we have sinned, committed iniquity, acted wickedly, and rebelled, even turning again aside from your commandments and ordinances. He remembers the prophecy, he's reading the prophecy of Jeremiah that says, God will end your captivity if you've repented. And he's thinking, I'm not sure if we've repented. He's repented, and just in case, he actually prays a prayer of repentance, not merely on his own behalf. It's not that he's been rebellious toward God, but on behalf of the entire nation. Moreover, we have not listened to your servants the prophets who spoke in your name to our kings, our princes, our fathers, and all the people of the land. We haven't listened, but we need to listen, Lord. Can you turn our hearts toward you? You get down to verse 20, and now while I was speaking and praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and presenting my supplication before the Lord my God on behalf of the holy mountain of my God, while I was still speaking in prayer, then the man Gabriel, whom I had seen in the vision previously, came to me in my extreme weariness about the time of the evening offering. And here's the prophecy that Gabriel brings. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now, 70 weeks. Notice the points along here are to finish the transgression, are to make an end of sin, are to make atonement for iniquity. By this time you ought to be saying, gee, this looks familiar. When was transgression finished? When was there an end to sin? When was atonement made for iniquity? To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, to anoint the most holy place. I submit to you that these were the things that the Messiah was supposed to do, and indeed, in a spiritual way at least, these are the things that the Messiah did do. When Jesus came, he accomplished all 6 of these things. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. Now, I don't think we're talking about literal weeks. I think we're talking about the same thing that Ezekiel described in Ezekiel chapter 4, when he describes, a day represents a year. And the same thing taking place here. 7 weeks is actually 7 times, 7 days in a week. And so 7 times 7, 49, not days, but 49 years. And 62 weeks, then it will be built again with plaza and moat and even entire press. And then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. Now we know what happened to Messiah. We know the rest of the story. Messiah was cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come, notice I have Messiah on the one hand, I have the people of the prince. Some folk maybe think that's another reference to Messiah, maybe not. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. Now, the beginning of the prophecy begins with a call to go out and rebuild Jerusalem. And there were a number of decrees. First of all, Cyrus issued a decree that the Jews would be allowed to return and rebuild their temple. That's in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, in the year 539 BC. Secondly, Darius comes on the scene in the year 520, the Jews were allowed to complete their temple. That's Ezra chapter 6, verses 8 through 12. But there's no mention made of the wall. The third decree that we read about, and again it's in the book of Ezra, is the decree of Artaxerxes. And in answer to this decree, Ezra brings another return, and there is a single reference in the describing of that decree, we'll look at it in a moment, of a wall. And then, of course, the fourth decree, because the wall isn't, not even sure if even though the permission is given, I'm not sure that the work really does begin until Nehemiah comes a few years later, 445 BC, still under the reign of Artaxerxes, and Nehemiah is allowed to rebuild the walls of the city. The dates, let's just look at the same list and let's put the dates, and we want to notice the date for the giving of the decree, and then we count forward 483 years. You see, with Cyrus nothing happened in 56 BC. We count from Darius in 520 BC where he gives his decree, Artaxerxes, who gives his decree in 457, and finally Artaxerxes gives that second decree in the days of Nehemiah in 445 BC. With Darius, that takes us to 37 BC. Again, nothing special with regard to Jerusalem takes place there, but that first decree of Artaxerxes, that brings us to 27 AD. Remember, there's no year zero, which is about the time that Messiah comes. That's the beginning, about the time when the ministry of Jesus begins. Again, if we go to the second decree of Artaxerxes, that takes us to 39 AD. Nothing special happens there. Although, to try to achieve that, there are some who are going to try to take those days and turn them into quote-unquote prophetic days of 360 days each. Sort of a strange way to get there from here. But they try to approach it in that way. I think they mean well. I'm just not sure that the prophecy allows us to do that. All right, some of the interpretations of this. First of all, I'm going to give you what we can call the Maccabean interpretation. We could also refer to it as the Jewish interpretation. If you ask a rabbi, he'll probably come up with this as the interpretation. And he sees that the 62 weeks and the 7 weeks not as consecutive, but as two separate groupings. The 7 weeks, that period from the destruction of the temple in 587 or 586 BC, depending on which calendar you read, to 538, 537 BC, where the return to Jerusalem takes place, and they finally begin work on the temple. And yet the 62 weeks, that is the 434 years, beginning with Daniel and that first fall of Jerusalem, and going all the way to the date when Antiochus comes into the city of Jerusalem, and the high priest is actually murdered, and it's going to be in the middle of that last week, in the year 168 BC, where in the middle of that quote-unquote 70th week, the temple is desecrated by Antiochus IV, and we've already discussed the rest of the story. So it puts this entire prophecy. Notice the anointed one, the one that's cut off, is the high priest, who, to be fair, was one who was anointed. You anointed prophets and priests and kings, so he was an anointed one, not the ultimate Messiah, but he was an anointed one who was cut off. And it's at least possible that we see a picture of Jesus in this. Secondly, there is the dispensational interpretation. The dispensational interpretation begins at usually around 444 BC. It doesn't have to, I suppose. But it has these, remember we talked about adapted years, where they're not real years, they're years of 360 days, and then it expands it. And then the dispensational view takes it all the way up to the crucifixion of Christ, which I think they might be right there. But then the dispensational view says, now there's this big giant gap where prophecy stops, and suddenly there's the church age, and at the end of that time there's the Christ comes back. They don't like to call it the second coming because there's another second coming, but they refer to that as the rapture. And then the 70th week takes place there. It was sort of God, has sort of stopped the stopwatch, and then he starts it up again, and finally there's the second coming of Christ. Notice this interpretation doesn't really. It has big gaps in the prophecy. It has to stop it and start it and insert other things. So it's something you read into the prophecy. It's not something you would get from the prophecy by reading it as it is. third view I'm going to call the historical interpretation, and I call it that because it's the interpretation that's been held for a long time. Dispensationalism is a really new view in the last couple of hundred years, but historically this is the view that's been held. Notice we have the first order to rebuild the walls of the Jerusalem, beginning in 457 BC. We go 69 weeks, and we get to the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. And then the 70th week is just what takes place next, in the middle of which Messiah is cut off, and then after which Jerusalem is destroyed, and that's within a generation. The city of Jerusalem is destroyed in 70 AD. So I don't need any gaps. I can just sort of take the prophecy as it stands. As we said, there's a passage in Ezra, it's in chapter 9, verse 9, where Ezra says, and this is part of his prayer, "For we are slaves, yet in our bondage our God has not forsaken us, but has extended loving kindness to us in the sight of the kings of Persia, to give us reviving, to raise up the house of our God, to restore its ruins, and to give us a wall." Notice the reference to a wall in Judah and Jerusalem. Now, is that speaking figuratively? Is that speaking literally? We can't be entirely sure. But then after the 62 weeks, this is Daniel chapter 9, verse 26, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come about with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wings of the abomination will come the one who makes desolate. This is that idea of the abomination of desolation. Now, Daniel 11 had spoken of the same thing in a prophecy that is very clearly Antiochus Epiphanes. And here again, the same language is used. An abomination of desolation will come, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now notice the layout of this. There is, first of all, the construction, from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Then there is this promise of Messiah until the Messiah, the Prince, comes. It will be built again. Again, the reference to construction, the city, the walls in the city being built. And then Messiah will be cut off. So there's, again, a second reference to Messiah. He's going to be cut off. And then there's this other person, the people of the Prince who is to come. I'm referring to him for a moment as the anti-Messiah, if you want to use the word antichrist, but that word sometimes has more packed into it from our present-day ideas than from that idea. But the people of the Prince who is to come is seen. And now there's, instead of construction, we have destruction. He will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and desolations are determined. And again, there's the mention of Messiah, or anti-Messiah. He will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. And finally, destruction. He will put a stop to the sacrifice and the grain offering. Can we put all this together? I think it's interesting that when Jesus comes on the scene, he references this prophecy, and he's speaking of something yet to come in his day. He's not looking back to Antiochus, because that was already fulfilled in his day. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, and just in the writer Matthew adds, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, and all sorts of bad things are going to happen. And so Jesus cites this prophecy and says, it's still yet to come. He goes on to say, whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Now Josephus, talking about the fall of Jerusalem that took place in 70 AD, and he gives us a blow-by-blow description. He says, the entire nation was now shut up by fate as in a prison, and the Roman army encompassed the city when it was crowded with inhabitants. They had a big feast day, and that's when the Romans came and surrounded the city of Jerusalem. Accordingly, the multitude of those that therein perished exceeded all the destructions that either men or God ever brought upon the world. That's a eyewitness to the fall of Jerusalem. That's how he described it. The question is this future yet still, or was this fulfilled in the days of Josephus, in the days of 70 AD? I think perhaps that it was.